Let's get right back to our inventory form now. And let's begin to look at our instructions on how to fill this sheet out. And we're going to put a couple of examples up here in a little bit, and we'll kind of all mess around with a couple of names and see what we can come up with on this thing. Joe, let's look at the first instruction.
Okay, it says on page 64, bottom of the page, in dealing with resentment, we set them on paper. We listed people, institution, or principles whom we were angry, period. We stop right there. And in the first column, we simply fill out those people that we're resentful at, the institutions, and the principles with whom we were angry in the first column, top to bottom, listing each and every one from top to bottom, all the way in that first column.
People, of course, that's self-explanatory. Institutions are those things such as the police department, the federal government, the Internal Revenue Service, the church, the post office, many institutions that we get upset with while we're out there drinking. Principles are those old guiding, I hate to call them laws, but I guess that's what they are, spiritual or laws that we've heard all of our life that seem to interfere with our style of drinking. 10 Commandments are a set of principles. And when I was out there drinking, I sure as hell didn't want to hear about the 10 Commandments because I'm breaking almost every one of them. As far as I know, not quite all, but almost every one of them. Another old principle that I hated to hear said, what goes up must come down. I never cared for that one. Another one said, what you give out's what you get back. And another one said, there are no free rides. You'll pay for everything you receive. And one my dad used to use on me, I hated it then, don't like it now, said, if you lay down with dogs, you'll get fleas on you every time. Old principles that people used to spout off at us whenever we were out there drinking and doing our thing. You don't have to be sober very long to do this. You don't have to be highly educated to do this. If you can't write, you feed the names to somebody else. Let them write them down for you. We simply start at the top. We put down the names of those people we're resentful toward. We put down the names of the institutions and the principles. Now, as you fill out this sheet, you'll notice the space is rather limited. And if you put down a name, and if you think there's going to be more than one cause, you better use a couple spaces for a name. If there's just going to be one cause, then you just need one space. For instance, Bill in his, for Mr. Brown, he had 3 different causes. For Mrs. Jones, she had 1, 2, 3, 4, about 5 there. So depending on how many causes there's going to be, just how much space you use for each name. Now, Bill listed 4 in the big book. Mr. Brown, Mrs. Jones, my employer, and my wife. Surely he had more than that. He probably just didn't want to use any more space in the book. I'm sure all of you guys can probably get all your resentments on one sheet. But I found out I couldn't. They came to me and they said, Charlie, make a list of your resentments. I said, I don't have any. And they said, well, surely you do. Maybe you don't understand what a resentment is. And they explained it to me, and I said, oh, yeah, I've got 1 or 2 of those. They said, well, put it down on a sheet of paper. And I got me a sheet of paper, and I listed on that sheet of paper about 8 or 9 or 10 names. Reached over and got another sheet of paper, listed 8 or 9 or 10 names. Reached over and got another sheet of paper, listed about 8 or 9 or 10 names. And I got up to about 157. And I said, man, you matter than hell to everybody. I did not know that. You can only see one resentment at a time in your head. And I don't think any of us will ever realize how many resentments we really do have, how much they control and dominate our thinking, till we get them all down on a sheet of paper and see the truth about them for the first time. Now, we've made a decision in step 3 to let God direct our thinking. And if we've got that many resentments, then those resentments, the people we resent, the institutions, the principles, they are directing our thinking and God can't. And I don't think any of us will ever realize that until we put them down on a sheet of paper and see how many of them we really do have. For me, it was absolutely amazing. We filled out the first column. We've learned something very valuable, how many resentments we really do have, and how much they control and dominate our thinking. Let's look at the second instruction.
So we ask ourselves why we were angry, period. And we stop right there. And simply using the example that Bill has there, we take beside each name under the cause, and using just 4 or 5 words, just like he did, we write down the cause. For instance, Mr. Brown, he was resentful of Mr. Brown, his attention to my wife. It wasn't a long dissertation. It was just simply 4 or 5 words describing the cause. And then if there's another cause, then we simply, underneath that, He told my wife and my mistress, again, 4 or 5 little words. Simplicity is the key here in this way, because we'll be using that later on. But simply beside each name, each principle, and each institution, simply write down in 4 or 5 words the cause beside each name, each principle, or each institution.
As I begin to fill out that second column and begin to put down the causes of the anger beside of each name, I begin to realize something that's turned out to be very valuable to me. I begin to realize it's really not the people and the institutions I'm upset with. It's what they've done to me that's got me upset. For instance, I could take Mr. Brown out of here and put Mr. Green in, and I'll be just as upset with Green as I am with Brown if he does the same thing. I could take my wife out of here and put my mistress in. I'll be just as upset with her if she does the same thing. For the first time, I begin to realize my problem is not with the people and the institutions. It's with what they do to me that gets me really upset. Now, the reason that's turned out to be so valuable for me is this. We're getting ready to start out on a lifetime process of developing the best possible relationship that we can have with the world and everybody in it. And a part of that relationship after a while is we're going to go ask those people to forgive us for the things we've done to them in the past. But by the same token, we're going to have to be able to forgive them. And a part of that forgiving process begins to happen right here. When we begin to realize it's not the people we're upset with, it's what they do to us, that begins to get names out of the picture, and it's going to make it a lot easier to handle this in the future. Now, we're going to list a couple of names on the inventory sheets, and we've got 2 volunteers that have agreed to write for us on the sheet. So if they would go to the screen and turn that thing on and take a look at our inventory sheet up there on the screen. In the first column, I'm going to list the name of the person that was on the top of my sheet, number 1, and it happened to be a lady named Barbara. 26, 27, 28 years ago, I really, really resented Barbara very deeply. Love her today, but I sure didn't love her very much 24, 25, 26, 27, 28 years ago. First name on your sheet.
Oh, what's her name? Rose.
Rose, okay. So in column 1, we've listed Barbara and Rose, and that's the only 2 we're going to put down. Of course, we had more than that, but we'll just use those 2 as an example. Now let's go to the cause. The reason I had it in for Barbara so badly is she had the audacity to file for divorce 3 times the last year before she went to Al-Anon. So we'll just put there by Barbara's name 3 divorces. She's spending more money on divorces and lawyers than I was on booze and everything that went with it. And I really, really had it in for her. I'll tell you how bad I had it in for her. I used to lay awake at night thinking about her and dreaming about the next day on her way to town or way to work, a big truck would run over her. And it was always going to be a truck from a well-known trucking company that had lots of money, and I could then sue them for about $3 or $4 million, and I could kill 2 birds with 1 stone, get rid of Barbara and get rich at the same time. Anybody in here ever have any ideas and fantasies like that toward people? Huh? Ooh. Joe, why did you resent Rose so badly?
Well, I was resentful at Rose because she was having an affair with another man after all I'd done to her. After all I'd done for her.
Extramarital affair, that's why. Okay, now we've completed the first 2 columns. Now let's go look at the 3rd column and see the instructions to fill it out.
Okay, in most cases, it was found that our self-esteem, our pocketbooks, our ambitions, our personal relationships, including sex, were hurt or threatened, so we were sore, we were burned up. On our grudge list, we set opposite each name our injuries. Was it our self-esteem, our security, our ambitions, our personal sex relations which had been interfered with? And simply, if we go to the 3rd column, and if the cause of what they had done, if it was effect to my self-esteem, again, this is 1 column at a time, top to bottom. If the cause was effect to my self-esteem, I'd put a little check mark there. If not, I would leave it blank. And then I'd go to the next name. And if the cause of what they did was a threat to my self-esteem, I'd put a little check mark there. If not, I'd leave it blank. Going 1 name at a time, 1 principle at a time, 1 institution at a time, from top to bottom, 1 column at a time under self-esteem.
Barbara filing for divorce 3 times in 1 year, is that a threat to my self-esteem? You better bet you it is. What are people going to think about me now? Hell, this is common knowledge now. We lived in a little town. She wouldn't even go back to the same lawyer. She went to 3 different lawyers, to make sure everybody knew what she was doing. Is Rose and her extramarital affair, is that a threat to Joe's self-esteem? You better bet you it is. What are people going to think about him now? So we put a little check mark by the side of the cause for those 2 people, and we would just simply complete that whole column while we're at it, going from top to bottom. If it's a threat, we make a check mark. If it's not, we leave it blank, and then we go to the second column.
And the cause of what they did was a threat to my personal relationship, I'd put a little check mark there. If not, I'd leave it blank, and then I'd go to the next name. And again, the cause was a threat to my personal relationship, I'd put a little check mark there. If not, I'd leave it blank, going from top to bottom, 1 column at a time, all the way through under personal relationships.
Barbara filing for divorce, is that a threat to my personal relationships? Sure it is. She's not going to have anything to do with me after the divorce. She's going to get the kids, and I'm not going to have any relationship with them either. Certainly that's a threat to my personal relationships. Is Rose, her affair, is that a threat to Joe's personal relationship? Probably is. They're probably not going to have anything to do with each other after this thing's all over with. So very carefully we make our check marks there, fill out the second column, then we go to the security instinct column.
And if the cause was a threat to my material security, I'd put a little check mark there. If not, I'd leave it blank, going from top to bottom, 1 column at a time under the material security column.
Barbara filing for divorce, is that a threat to my security instinct, my material security? You better bet it is. She's going to get it all before she gets through. Rose's extramarital affair, is that a threat to Joe's material security? Probably not. We would just leave that one blank. Very carefully, we would work that column under material security, checking off by the side of each cause or leaving it blank, whichever is appropriate. Then we would go to the next column.
Under the emotional security, if what they did was a threat to my emotional security, I'd put a little check mark. If not, I'd leave it blank, going 1 column at a time all the way down the column under emotional security beside each person, principal, or institution.
Barbara filing for divorce, is that a threat to my emotional security? Sure it is. I'm just a basket case now, worrying about the divorce and worrying about what people are going to think about me and worrying about the kids and worrying about the money, an absolute basket case. Is Rose's affair a threat to Joe's emotional security? Most certainly it is. He's going to be upset by this. There's no doubt about that at all. Very carefully we fill out that column. Then we go to the sex column.
And if what they did was a threat to my acceptable sex relations, I'd put a little check mark. If not, I'd leave it blank. Again, going all the way down beside each name, top to bottom.
Barbara filing for divorce, is that a threat to my acceptable sex relations? As far as I know, she's not going to let me have any after we get a divorce. Rose's extramarital affair, is that a threat to Joe's acceptable sex relations? Certainly it is. It's going to all be busted up right there. There's not going to be any sexual relations there at all. Very carefully, working always top to bottom. Check it if so, leave it blank if not. Now let's go to the hidden sex relation.
If what they did was a threat to my hidden sex relation, I'd put a little check mark there. If not, I would leave it blank. Again, going from top to bottom, 1 name at a time, all the way down.
Barbara filing for divorce, is that a threat to my hidden sex relations? Let's
Let's put
the question mark there. We'll just leave that.
Talk that over with your sponsor.
If I had any sexual relations on the outside that was hidden, Barbara filing for divorce probably would not be a threat to that because they wouldn't be interfering with each other, so I would leave that blank. How about Rose and her extramarital affair? Is that a threat to any hidden sex relations Joe's got?
No.
Now, Joe, don't talk about the goat, whatever you do.
I'm not going to tell you about the goat.
Okay, so we just leave it blank also. Now let's go to the ambition columns.
And if what they did was a threat to my social ambitions, I'd put a little check mark there. If not, I'd leave it blank.
Barbara filing for divorce, is that a threat to my social instinct ambitions for the future? Most certainly. Rose's affair, is that a threat to his ambitions for the future and his social instinct? Certainly, we would check both of those. Then we go to the next column.
Under the security instinct for them ambitions, and if what they did was a threat to my security instinct, I'd put a little check mark there. If not, I'd leave it blank.
Barbara filing for divorce, is that a threat to my security ambitions for the future? Most certainly. She's probably going to end up with child support, maybe a little alimony, and I'm probably going to be paying for that for the rest of my life. Rose's extramarital affair, is that a threat to Joe's security ambitions for the future? Probably not. I doubt very seriously if that would interfere with his money for the future. It may. If we're in doubt, we just put a check mark. If we're not in doubt, we leave it blank. If we know that it's not, and if we know that it is, we make a check mark. Very simple instruction. How about the third one?
Then we go to our sexual ambitions for the future, and if it was a threat to our sexual ambitions for the future, we'd put a little check mark. If not, we'd leave it blank.
Barbara filing for divorce, is that a threat to my sexual ambitions of the future? Probably so. I'd kind of like to keep up with her if I can, you know. Rose's extramarital affair, is that a threat to his sexual ambitions in the future? Probably so. Now, in this particular case, it just happened to almost wipe us out all the way across the board. Some cases you'll only have, by the side of a cause, 1 or 2 or 3 check marks. In this particular case, we check nearly every one of them right across the board. Now, if you'll fill these self-columns out one at a time, I think you'll see certain patterns begin to develop. Maybe you'll have a check mark under the self-esteem column by the side of nearly every cause. Maybe you'll find nearly all of them filled out under the acceptable sex column. Maybe it'll be filled out mainly under the material security column. It's probably going to be a combination of all, but you're going to see 1 or 2 of those columns really stand out, really predominate, and it begins to give us an idea of what part of self are we really having a problem with. Maybe self-esteem is a real problem for us. Maybe material security is a real problem. At least we'll be able to get an idea of which ones are giving us the most trouble. Okay, that's all we're going to write now for a little bit. Let's just leave the screen on, and if you guys want to, you can rest a little bit, and I'll holler at you again after a while, okay? Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Now, as I finish the 3rd column, I learned for me what has turned out to be the most valuable thing that I've ever learned. For the first time in my life, I saw where anger comes from. I've always had a problem with anger. I've always reacted with anger, and I've always said and done and hurt people through anger, and then I would be sorry of it and say, I'll not do that again, and I'd turn right around and do it again over and over and over. You see, I never knew where anger came from. I thought it was just one of those feelings that flitted into your mind, that you could do nothing about it and nothing to control it. And certainly we can't do anything about a problem till we understand the problem. For the first time I realized anger comes from a threat to one of my basic instincts of life, and it's how I choose to react to that threat which is going to determine whether I'm angry or not. Now I find today, if my basic instincts are under control and my relationship with God is right, you can say and do just about anything you want to me, and I'm not going to get angry, upset, and resentful over it. But just as sure as my basic instincts are not under control, and my relationship with God isn't right, then just about anything you do to me is going to create anger and resentment. Again, let me give you an example. This lady I'm married to today, this Barbara I'm married to now, the same one that I used to hate so badly. If there's any such thing as a black belt Al-Anon, it's Barbara. She's been in the Al-Anon Fellowship now going on 27 to 28 years. Got a real fine program. We have a great relationship, and I love her deeply. But Barbara's like all human beings. She has the basic instincts of life also, and she has this thing called self-will too. And from time to time, maybe she will be a little bit out of kilter, and she'll say and do something to me that threatens one of my basic instincts of life. Threatens my self-esteem, or threatens my material security, or threatens my sex life in some way. And I find that if my relationship with God is right, and my instincts are under control, I'm able to say to myself, well, the poor old thing, they're sick too, just like all the rest of us are, and it'll just slide off of my back, and it just won't hurt me and won't bother me at all. Now, 2 or 3 weeks from now, the same lady does exactly the same thing. Only this day my relationship with God's not right, and my instincts are not under control, and I react with anger and resentment, and I cuss her out, and I romp and stomp, and I raise hell with Barbara and everybody around me all day long. Now, the same lady did exactly the same thing, but I choose to react to it in an entirely different manner based upon my relationship with God and whether my instincts are under control or not. Thank God I've learned that. Because you see, I can't do anything about Barbara. I can't do anything about people. I can't do anything about institutions. But with God's help, maybe I can do something about my reaction to it, and I don't have to get so angry. And if I don't have to get so angry and upset, then I'm in much less chance of drinking than I was before I began to realize what causes this anger. This is one of the greatest things I've ever learned for me. That if I get angry and I get upset, it's because I've chosen to react to that threat with anger and with resentment, and it's really based upon my relationship with God as to whether I get angry or not.
Bottom page 65, it says, we went back, we went back through our lives. It's getting dark. We went back through our lives. Nothing counted but thoroughness and honesty. When we were finished, we considered it carefully. The first thing apparent was this world and its people were often quite wrong. To conclude that others was wrong as far as most of us ever got. I always blamed other people for my problems. The usual outcome was that people continued to wrong us and we stayed sore. Sometimes it was remorse and then we sore at ourselves. But the more we fought and tried to have our own way, the worse matters got. As in war, the victor only seemed to win. Our moments of triumph were short-lived. Now, it's plain that a life which includes deep resentment leads only to futility and unhappiness. To the precise extent that we permit these, that we squander the hours which might have been worthwhile.
And I read that last statement, and I stopped, and I tried to look back in my life and see how much time I've actually squandered and wasted in resentments. Now, I don't know about you guys, but I know about me. And when I've got a good resentment churning around in my head, I'm pretty well paralyzed from doing anything worthwhile. All I want to do is run that thing through my head and deal with that thing over and over and over and over again. Now, one of my favorite things that I used to do when I was drinking was get up early in the morning, have a drink of whiskey and a cup of coffee, and turn on my resentment replay machine and replay what she did to me yesterday, and replay what he did to me last week, and replay what they did to me last month, and replay what my boss did to me 6 months ago, and replay what my neighbor did to me a year ago, and replay what my brother did to me 5 years ago, and replay what my mother said to me 10 years ago, and replay what my daddy did to me 15 years ago, and replay what my grandpa did 20 years ago. And it took me just about an hour to run through that tape. And I loved every moment of it. And when that tape would run out, I'd have another drink of whiskey and another cup of coffee, and then I would turn on my get even machine. Now, by God, the next time she does that, I'll do this, and she'll say that, and I'll say this, and she'll do that, and I'll put it on her, and they're not going to treat me that way. And it took me just about an hour to run that tape through my head. I have spent literally thousands and thousands and thousands of hours in resentments. And I found that when I got to AA, the only difference was I wasn't having the drink of whiskey. I was getting up early in the morning, have a cup of coffee, turn on my get even machine, run it, or my resentment machine, run it for an hour, have another cup of coffee and turn on my get even machine and run it for an hour. And I was wasting just as much time in sobriety in AA with resentments as I was before I got to AA when I used to drink. Now, as a human being, it seems as though I'm only allowed so much time here on earth. And my time on earth is beginning to get pretty close to the end of it. And I'm 65 years old this year. And this is the first time in my life that I've ever been sober, and I feel good at the same time. First time in my life I've ever been sober and had some peace of mind, serenity, and happiness. First time in my life I've ever been sober and been able to really, really enjoy life, and I love every moment of it. And I've only got so much of it left. And I'll be damned if I'm going to waste any more of it in resentments when they don't be doing any good whatsoever, period. These resentments are an absolute waste of time. They never straighten up a relationship with another human being. They never made me feel better. They only made me feel worse. They never made me a nickel, period. And I've spent a good percentage of my lifetime in dealing with these resentments, and it's absolute wasted time. That's a bad deal. But that's not the worst thing. Here's the worst thing about a resentment.
But with the alcoholic whose hope is the maintenance and growth of a spiritual experience, this business of resentment is infinitely grave. We found that it is fatal. For when harboring such feelings, we shut ourselves off from the sunlight of the Spirit. The insanity of alcohol returns and we drink again, and with us to drink is to die.
That's what's wrong with a resentment. A resentment very effectively blocks God out of the mind. And with God blocked out of the mind, we don't feel good. And our mind wants to feel better. And it begins to search for something to make it feel better. And it will always remember the sense of ease and comfort that comes at once by taking a few drinks. Next thing you know, we get to thinking about drinking. Next thing you know, we become insane and we believe it's okay to drink. And the next thing you know, we end up drunk all over again. That's the worst thing about a resentment. It will absolutely block you off from God, from other people, and eventually end up getting you drunk. Now, if we were to live, we had to be free of anger. The grouch and the brainstorm were not for us. They may be the dubious luxury of normal men, but for alcoholics, these things are poison. We turn back to the list for it held the key to the future. We were prepared to look at it from an entirely different angle. Always before I looked at it to see what those suckers had done to me. Today I look at it to see what that resentment is doing to me. And if it's going to get me drunk, then I'm looking at it from an entirely different angle. We begin to see that the world and its people really dominated us. In that state, the wrongdoing of others, fancied or real, had power to actually kill. And I stopped and I said to myself, Charlie, how dumb can you be? All my life I've been proud of the fact that I stand on my own 2 feet. Nobody tells me what to do. I don't need your advice, thank you. And when I read that last statement, I suddenly realized that other people have controlled and dominated my thinking as far back as I can remember through my resentments toward them. When I'm resenting them, they are determining how I'm thinking. And if they're determining how I think, then they determine how I act, and they determine what my life is going to be. Now, when I begin to see that and see how dumb that is, I begin to say to myself, you really are stupid, because some of these people have been dead and buried for years, and reaching out from the grave, and they've had me by the yang-yang as far back as I can remember. And when I saw that, I said, to hell with them. I'm not going to let those people, alive or dead, live in my head rent-free any longer. I've made a decision to let God might direct my thinking, and if those people, alive or dead, justified or unjustified, direct my thinking, then God can't, and that's all there is to it. Now, something miraculous happened to me when I saw that. You know, we alcoholics fancy ourselves as reasonably intelligent people. And when we see the truth about these resentments, and we see how those people have controlled and dominated us all of our lives through those resentments, that looks pretty stupid. Oh, they look good in your head, but it looks dumb when you see it on paper. And about 95% of those resentments automatically disappeared when I saw what they were doing to me through my resentments toward them. But if you're like I am, you're probably going to have 2, 3, 4, or 5 that have been embedded in your mind so deeply, so long, that you're probably going to have a little help to get rid of that too. We now come to the first prayer in the big book on step 4. You hear always about the step 3 prayers, the step 7 prayers. Nobody ever hears about the step 4 prayers. Let's see how we can get rid of those deeply embedded resentments that do not automatically disappear when we see how dumb they really are.
The book says, how could we escape? We saw that these resentments must be mastered, but how? We could not wish them away any more than alcohol. See, and remember, we can't heal a sick mind with a sick mind. Well, this was our course. We realized that the people who had wronged us were perhaps spiritually sick, though we did not like their symptoms and the way they disturbed us. They, like ourselves, were sick too. We asked God to help us to show them the same tolerance, pity, and patience that we would cheerfully grant a sick friend. When a person offended, we said to ourselves, this is a sick man. How can I be helpful to him? God save me from being angry. Thy will be done. There's the prayer. See, we avoid retaliation or argument. We wouldn't treat sick people that way. If we do, we destroy our chance of being helpful. We cannot be helpful to all people, but at least God will show us how to take a kindly and tolerant view of each and every one. And I'm like Charlie. I've spent many, many nights, days, weekends, hours in resentment, and I didn't even know that I had them. But I've always tried to get even with those people. And I have tried some really, really sick things to get even with people, because I used to hurt people trying to get even. Really, I did. You know, and I finally figured out how to get even with people. Now listen, if you will. The way you get even with people is you love them. See, that's the last thing I ever tried. And when you love people, then you're even with them. And see, I didn't know that.
I thought you were supposed to kill them.
I did too. I know that whenever this Rose that we have on the screen here, after all I've done for her, and she treated me the way she did. But I've been gone for about 4 months, you see, out running around, doing my thing. And she'd filed for divorce again. Of course, I didn't know that. It wouldn't surprise me, but I didn't know it at the time. But I was sitting in the bar one night, and I got to drinking, and I got to thinking. Now, you all know either drink or think, but don't get the two of them mixed up. And I got to drinking one night, and I got to thinking, well, you know, Rose hadn't seen me in about 3 or 4 months, and I know she'd be lonely. I mean, wouldn't you be lonely if you hadn't seen me in 3 or 4 months? So I think I'll go over there and see old Rose. So what I did is I went over to the house, and I knocked on the door, and she peeked. Well, what had happened, I just broke in, okay? And I just got on in there. It's like you're supposed to. And I got in that house, and there sat an old boy in my recliner, watching my TV in my house, and I'm making payments on all that. What are you going to do? I did it. I jumped on that old boy, and he like to beat me to death in my own living room floor. And he threw me out in the yard and told me not to ever come back. Well, I'm resentful pretty good about that. So I went back to this place that I was staying, and I looked in the mirror, and he'd black my eyes clear down past my glasses. I mean, he'd really beat me up good. And I used that for a long time. And I carried all of that anger and resentment into my next marriage. And I had a list of things about this long that I wasn't going to let this next one do. You see? And she come out of a bad deal too. And she had a list of things this long that she wasn't going to let me do. And we were trying to enforce our lists on each other, had no way to deal with it, and no wonder we had trouble too, you see. Now I'm sober. I'm sober in Alcoholics Anonymous about 3 or 4 months. And I went to a little conference down in Apache, Oklahoma. Now you can't get to Apache, Oklahoma from here, so don't even try. You know, Indian guide and a search warrant to get there.
It's a waste of time.
Yeah, it's a waste of time, yeah. But that weekend they had a conference of Alcoholics Anonymous, and there was over 700 people in that little old town, about 200. We really took it over. But I met a lady there that night. Her name was Alabama Carruthers, and some of you might have known Alabama, a great lady. And she lived out in California, and she just loved Alcoholics Anonymous, and she was about 62 or 3 years old. And she was so energetic, and she was so much in love with Alcoholics Anonymous and grateful. Just a real lady, and I loved her right away. And that particular night, she said something during her talk that just kind of went through me, just kind of hit me, you know. And she said that night in her talk, she said, I have peace of mind today. And God, it just kind of hit me like that. I said, that's all I've ever wanted was peace of mind. That's all I've ever wanted was peace of mind. And after that meeting that night, we finally got Alabama alone, and everybody went to their rooms. It was about 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning. I would sit down with Alabama, and I began to talk to Alabama because I really liked her. And Alabama began to ask me questions about me. And she said, how come you're not in bed? I said, because I can't sleep. She said, how long have you been sober? I said, about 3 to 4 months, about 4 months at that time. And I said, I lay awake nights, and I just think all the time. My mind just races uncontrollably, round and around and around. And she said, what goes on in your head? And I told her a lot of things that I told her. And she said, well, Joe, you're just full of resentments. And I said, well, what is a resentment? And she said, a resentment are old angers and old hurts that are refelt over and over again. And all that anger that you intend to use on those other people, you're turning it and using it on yourself. And you're hurting yourself with it, and you're making yourself sick. And I could see that just as plain as day. And I said, is there any solution to this? I must have a solution. And she said, yes, there is. Now, Alabama was a lady who was dressed wild, and she had a purse about this big and about that tall. Well, maybe it was this big and about that tall. Looked like a trunk, but she carried this purse, and she reached down in this purse, and she just happened to have one of these books in there. And she whipped this book out, and she said, Joe, on page 551 in this book, and it's called a Freedom from Bondage section, is a story about a lady who was extremely resentful, and she used this resentment to justify all kinds of bad actions and bad attitudes on her part. She said, if you'll read this, and there's a solution in there, it may help you. So I picked up her book, and I began to read this on page 551. It's the 3rd paragraph from the top. And this lady said, I've had many spiritual experiences since I've been in the program. Many that I didn't recognize right away, for I'm slow to learn, and they take many guises. But one was so outstanding that I like to pass it on whenever I can, in the hope that it will help someone else as it has helped me. As I said earlier, self-pity and resentment were my constant companions. And my inventory began to look like a 33-year diary, for I seemed to have a resentment against everybody I'd ever known. All but one responded to the treatment suggested in the steps immediately.
When she filled out her sheet, saw the truth of them, all but one of them disappeared.
But this one posed a problem. It was against my mother, and it was 25 years old. I had fed it, fanned it, and nurtured it as one might a delicate child, and it has become as much a part of me as my breathing. It had provided me with my excuses for my lack of education, my marital failures, personal failures, inadequacies, and of course my alcoholism. And though I really thought I'd been willing to part with it now, I knew I was reluctant to let it go. She used that resentment against her mother to justify her lack of education and her marital failures and inadequacies and of course her alcoholism. She really used it well, didn't she? One morning, however, I realized I had to get rid of it, for my reprieve was running out. If I didn't get rid of it, I was going to get drunk, and I didn't want to get drunk anymore. In my prayers that morning, I asked God to point out to me some way to be free of this resentment. During the day, a friend of mine brought me some magazines to take to a hospital group I was interested in. And I looked through them, and a banner across the front of one featured an article by a prominent clergyman in which I caught the word resentment. Now, he said, in effect, and here it is, if you have a resentment you want to be free of, if you will pray for the person or thing that you resent, you will be free. If you will ask in prayer for everything you want for yourself to be given to them, you will be free. Ask for their health, their prosperity, their happiness, and you will be free. Even when you don't really want it for them and your prayers are only words, you don't mean it. Go ahead and do it anyway. Do it every day for 2 weeks, and you will find you've come to mean it and want it for them. And you will realize that where you used to feel bitterness, resentment, and hatred, You now feel compassion, understanding, and love. Well, I went back home after that conference, got in the bed that night, and I got to thinking, well, I'm not doing anything anyhow. Might as well pray for those people. So I started praying for them. And the next day, every time I could think about it, I prayed for them. And that night, the next day, and this went on and on and on. Every time I could think about them and these people, I prayed, and my list got longer and longer. And one day, and I don't know how long it was, but 2 or 3 weeks later, I was at the corner of 31st and Lewis there in Tulsa. It's a beautiful, beautiful area. And I got stuck in this stoplight. And it was just the length of this stoplight, all this was. It was one of those beautiful spring mornings. And I looked over there at this beautiful house, and the grass was the greenest green I had ever seen. You know, all the little tulips were all out in full bloom. The little squirrels were jumping around in the trees. The birds were singing. One of those beautiful, beautiful spring mornings that we all love so well. And I noticed it for the first time. I said, my God, that's beautiful. That is beautiful. And I asked myself, how long has it been since I'd seen those things? And do you know, I could not remember. When they talk about being cut off from the sunlight of the Spirit, I know what they mean. I really do. Because up until that time, I think in my life, everything was just black and white. There was no color, absolutely no color, until that morning, and that I was aware. And that was the morning that I knew that this program would work for me. And my life hasn't been the same since that morning. Because since that morning, I want everything this program has to offer, and I can have it. It's mine, you see. Because I know that I'm one of God's kids. And everything is available to me. All I have to do is do these things. You know.
If you've got a resentment and you don't want to get rid of it, for God's sake, don't pray about it. Because if you pray about it, you're going to get rid of it. I know. I had one against another man. And I would gladly have killed him, I believe, if I could have gotten by with it and not have to go to the penitentiary. It was one of those carry to the grave kind of resentments. I had no intention of getting rid of it. But somewhere in this process, it began to bother me. And I went to my sponsor and asked him about it. And he said, Charlie, you've got to get rid of that resentment. And I said, I don't want to get rid of this resentment. He said, that's absolutely beside the point. If you don't get rid of it, it's going to get you drunk sooner or later. And in my smart mouth manner, I said, how in the hell am I going to do that? He said, let me show you. He took me to the same page that Alabama took Joe to. And he said, now read that, go home and do what it says, and you'll get rid of that resentment. And I went home and I got down on my knees, which I didn't do very often in those days. And I said, God, I want you to give that son of a bitch everything he deserves. And that's the only prayer that I had for him that day.
The next day he was driving around in a Cadillac.
The next day I prayed, and the next day I prayed, and some 4, 5, 6, 7 days later, I don't know when, I began to find myself saying something I didn't intend to say. I began to find myself saying, God, give him in his life what I want in my life. Give him the same peace of mind, serenity, and happiness that I seek for myself. And I prayed that prayer a few days, and one morning I woke up, and that resentment had absolutely, completely disappeared, and it's never come back since that time. And what was really amazing to me, and the irony in the whole situation, it wasn't but just a matter of a few months, and that guy moved in next door to me, and we became next-door neighbors. And we got along just fine with each other from that time on. This thing really does work. And I think the reason it works so well is because prayer for another human being is probably the greatest expression of love that one human being can have for another. And love and hate simply cannot exist on the same plane. And if you take each one of these individual resentments, pray for them every day, sooner or later, love is going to replace the resentment. And you'll find that the resentment's going to be gone. Now just think. If 95% of these resentments disappear because they look so stupid on paper when I see what they're doing to me, if I could get rid of the other 5% through prayer, then that means that my mind can be free of the damaged and unsaleable goods called resentments to the level that God intended for it to be. Now this file cabinet that I had that was full of resentments has now been emptied out. And another natural law applies now. And that law is that nature abhors a vacuum. There's no such thing as a vacuum or a void. Something's always rushing in to fill it up. If those resentments disappear, they're going to have to be replaced with something else. God's not going to leave another hole in my head. I've got enough of them already. And the only thing that can replace the resentment will be the opposite of the resentment. And where my mind used to be filled with resentments, it's now filled with love, patience, tolerance, compassion, and goodwill toward my fellow man. I'm in much less chance of getting drunk than I was before I started this process. And we want to emphasize over and over and over again, none of these steps are negative. Every step has a positive happening to it. If resentments have been replaced by love, patience, tolerance, and goodwill, I'm already beginning to feel a lot better. And in a third of my mind, I'm much less chance of getting drunk than I was before I started. And you know what really blew my mind? Is one day I woke up to the full realization. To get love, patience, tolerance, compassion, and goodwill, I didn't have to go to any other fellowships. And I didn't have to read any other books. If God dwells within me, and my book says He does, then those things have always been a part of my makeup. I just never could use them before. In my chase for money, power, prestige, and sex, and what I thought were the good things of life, those qualities had to be repressed to allow me to operate on the level I wanted to operate on. But now that the resentments are gone, they automatically start coming back to the surface. I have never seen anything like this in my life. It is so simple. We don't have to understand why. We don't have to understand how it works. All we have to do is do what the book says, and one morning we wake up with a degree of peace of mind, serenity, and happiness that we've probably never had before. Isn't this something? Such a simple little process.
You know, I had a number of people come to me after one of these resentment sessions and said, I prayed for those people and they didn't change. And of course I have to point out, and I'm sure there's someone here maybe who's thinking the same way. The idea is not for them to change. The idea is for my feelings toward them to change. A lot of those people that I prayed for are still SOBs. They're going to die SOBs, I suppose, but that's not my business. But the point is that I don't lay awake nights thinking about them, how I'm going to kill them or get even with them. You know, I feel sorry for them that they're going to go and spend the rest of their life being who and what they are. And I can't help it. So the idea is, every time I pray, I change just a little bit. And, you know, I pray again and change just a little bit. So they said prayer changes things. Well, prayer doesn't change things. Prayer changes people, and people change things, you see. And you put enough of those prayers together, and then you've changed a bit. All the time, it's me that's doing the changes, not them. I can't expect other people to change. That's their business, not mine.
Now, it would do me no good, though, to get rid of all these resentments if I didn't know how to keep them from coming back. Because the world's full of sick people, and they're going to do it to me again tomorrow. And if I'm not careful, I'll resent them. And it seems as though I can't have just one resentment. Whenever I get one, I end up very shortly with 2, and then 3, 6, 8, 10, and next thing you know, I'm a basket case all over again. I've got to do one more thing before we finish with resentments. Let's now look at your fourth column on that inventory sheet. And that fourth column says, what's the exact nature of my wrongs, faults, mistakes, defects, shortcomings, or whatever? Yeah, we'll need somebody back up. Yeah. Now, the resentment is the wrong. That's what blocks me off from the sunlight of the Spirit. But now then, what I'm going to do is look at the exact nature of that resentment. And you're going to find in the fourth column there 4 basic character defects that all human beings have to one degree or another. Selfishness, dishonesty, self-seeking, frightened, and inconsiderate. Now, to really understand how to do it, I went to the dictionary and I looked up the word nature. I always thought it dealt with birds and bees only. But I found out the nature of something is what is the inherent characteristic of it, what's at the core of it, what's the real truth about it. Now, we're going to look at the real truth about this resentment. Let's go to page 67, third paragraph. Referring to our list again, putting out of our minds the wrongs others have done, we resolutely look for our own mistakes. We've never done this before. We've always looked to see their mistakes, but we've never looked to see our mistakes. Or had we been selfish, dishonest, self-seeking, and frightened, and we put inconsiderate on there because it'll be used in another page or 2. Though a situation had not been entirely our fault, we tried to disregard the other person involved entirely. What were we to blame? The inventory was ours, not the other man's. When we saw our faults, we listed them. We placed them before us in black and white. We admitted our wrongs honestly, and were willing to set these matters straight. So I go back to my list, and I looked at that first name on my list, this lady named Barbara. And now then I can read it from left to right. Barbara was the first name on the list, and the reason I hated her so badly is because of those 3 divorces. And the part of self that was affected was practically every part of self, and I really had it in for her. But then I said, now, Charlie, do what your book said to do. Forget what Barbara did. Forget about her filing for the divorces. What did you do to set this thing in motion, if anything? And all of a sudden it dawned on me that if I hadn't been so selfish, I wouldn't have been out there doing some of the things I was doing, and I wouldn't have got caught. And Barbara probably wouldn't have filed for divorce in the first place. If I'd been a little more honest, I wouldn't have been sneaking around behind my wife's back and lying to her all the time, and she probably wouldn't have filed for divorce in the first place. So I put a little check mark there under selfish, and I put a little check mark there under dishonesty. And I began to realize that if I hadn't been so self-seeking and frightened, getting close to 40 years old, saying to myself, if you don't get out there and get some of it now, you'll be too old to do that before very long. Fear drives us, rules us, dominates us. If I hadn't been so frightened of that situation, I wouldn't have been doing some of those things, and she wouldn't have filed for divorce. So I put a little check mark under that one too. And then I looked in the inconsideration column. If I really considered my wife and my children's welfare ahead of my own, I wouldn't have been doing those things I was doing and take a chance on getting caught with them. All Barbara did was retaliate against me for things that I myself had done. It's plain that a life run on self-will can hardly ever be a success, because under those conditions we're always in collision with people, places, and things. Based on what I had done, I had hurt Barbara and my children. She in turn retaliated with these divorces. Now, I finally saw why I loved the resentments so well. Because every time I played that resentment over in my head, I distorted the picture just a little bit. And every time I played it over, I made what she did worse. And I made what I did less. And let me play it long enough, I can finally transfer all blame to her and make her the devil and make me as pure as the driven snow. And then go right on and live my life the way I wanted to live it. And I thought, my God, Charlie, I didn't know that's what you were doing with that resentment. And I thought, I wonder if there's any more on this sheet like this. And I went down my sheet, name by name by name, and looked in that 4th column on every one of them. And I didn't like what I saw. I saw what I had become during my drinking years. And I had become a very selfish human being, and a very dishonest human being, a very self-seeking, frightened, and inconsiderate human being. And based on those character defects, I did things to hurt those people in those institutions. They in turn retaliated against me. I in turn, through my resentment toward them, distorted the picture in every case and transferred all blame to them and made me pure, and that way I could go ahead and live my life the way I wanted to live it. My God, no wonder I loved resentments. In all my lifetime, I've never been placed in jail for sober driving. Never. Never been drug into a divorce court for being a good husband and a good father. Never had the hell beat out of me for keeping my mouth shut. Every resentment I ever had, I started it. Now, if you're a practicing alcoholic, you've got to develop these kind of skills. I don't think we could live with ourselves if we had to honestly see what's going on whenever we're drinking. But you see, we don't have to see that. Through this thing called resentments, in every case we distort the picture. We transfer all blame to other people, make ourselves as pure as the driven snow, and then say to hell with them. And if we're a man, we go from woman to woman to woman to woman. If we're a woman, we go from man to man to man. If it's a job, we go from job to job to job, never thinking that maybe we need to change, because we don't realize we need to change. No wonder we alcoholics love our resentments. My God, what a great thing they were for us. And now, if I could become just a little less selfish, a little less dishonest, a little less self-seeking, frightened, and inconsiderate, then probably I won't hurt as many people in institutions. And maybe they won't retaliate, and maybe I won't have to resent them, and maybe I won't have to get drunk over it. But you can bet your boots, if I stay selfish, dishonest, self-seeking, frightened, and inconsiderate, I'm going to keep right on doing the same things I've always done. I'm going to keep right on hurting people, and they're going to retaliate, and I'm going to resent, and sooner or later I'm going to get drunk over it. Joe, how about you and Rose?
You know, you have to understand a bit about me before you can do this, I think. But remember, Dr. Jung told Roland that ideas, emotions, and attitudes, which were once the guiding force of the lives of these men, are suddenly cast to one side. Suddenly. Well, many, many years ago, I'll never forget it. I made a decision, and I said, I don't need God. Remember, I told you that. I don't need God, and I don't need nothing, and I don't need anybody. And if it's going to happen in this world, it's going to happen because I make it that way. And if you get in my way, you shouldn't have. And if you got in my way, I would lash out with you. And I would hurt you, and I would hurt other people, and I did that. That's the kind of person I was. That's the kind of person I had to become, and I lived that way for a long, long time. And I made a lot of decisions based upon that third column, based upon self. Because if you don't have God or nothing or nobody, you're making decisions based on self, which later put me in a position to be hurt. So when I got with old Rose, and we dated for a while, we got drunk one night, or I did. I don't know what happened. I woke up one morning and I was married. And absolutely no planning on my part, if you understand what I mean. And I got married. And here I am. And I said, well, I'll try to make the best of this deal. But I'm certainly not going to consider her very much. See, I was totally a selfish individual, and I wasn't concerned about her at all. Really, I wasn't. I hate to say that, but that was the truth. And so, no wonder I was a totally selfish individual, certainly. Only concerned about what I wanted. And I wanted what I wanted when I wanted it. Seemed to be the way that I lived. And certainly I was dishonest with her. I couldn't even tell her the truth about how I felt about us getting married. Dishonest, totally dishonest with her and everybody else and myself. Certainly I was self-seeking. I wasn't frightened about anything, but I was self-seeking. I only wanted what I wanted. And certainly I was inconsiderate. I was totally inconsiderate of her wants and needs or anything that she wanted. I was totally inconsiderate about it. I'd come home maybe I would, and maybe I wouldn't. And if I come home and she was upset and mad, I could care less. I mean, I'm sorry, but that's just the way it was. And I was a very sick individual in so many ways. So I had to revamp and rebuild my life totally from the bottom up, and had to be able to look at these things honestly. And it was difficult. I needed the help of a lot of other people to help me see these things honestly. I did the best I could do, but I needed the help of other people to help me to see and to be honest about these things. I just simply didn't know that. I just didn't know. And I hurt a lot of people. Certainly I hurt her terribly. And I've tried to make amends to her over these years, and I think that I've accomplished those things. But I didn't know that until I looked at them in this manner.
Now, this doesn't necessarily excuse what Rose did.
No.
But what it does do is show Joe where he put himself in a position to have that done to him. You know, I don't blame Rose. I would have done the same thing. I don't blame Barbara. I would have done the same thing. I don't blame the police. I would have done the same thing. I don't blame the Internal Revenue Service. Hell, if I hadn't been cheating on my income tax, they wouldn't have been throwing me in jail to start with if I hadn't been so dishonest. Every problem I've ever had centers around those basic character defects in that fourth column. You know, back in step 3, it said we invariably find that we've made decisions based on self, which later placed us in a position to be hurt. We got to do one more thing before you guys sit down completely now.
Yeah.
We're getting close to being done here now.
One more thing.
One more thing.
Yeah.
We're in the process of doing step 4, so up at the top of that sheet, about the middle, let's just put the number 4.
Right at the top, real big, number 4.
Right up in the top of the sheet, about the middle of it, we'll just write the number 4 up there in a blank space somewhere.
Just a big number 4.
Yeah. We're doing the resentment part of our step 4 right now. Now, out there in the fourth column, we now see the exact nature of the wrong that we're going to discuss with another human being when we take step 5.
In the fourth column.
So in the fourth column, let's just write a 5 in that fourth column.
A big number 5 below those two names. Below those, on the fourth column, a big number 5.
Yeah. Okay, also in the fourth column, I now see the character defects that I'm going to become willing to turn loose of in step 6. So let's put a 6 right under that 5 in the fourth column. Also in that fourth column, I see the shortcomings I'm going to ask God to take away in step 7. So let's put a 7 right under that 5 and 6. Now back in the first column, many of those names are people we've hurt. In my case, all of them. In your case, probably part of them. Now the big book tells me when I get to step 8, we have the list. We made it when we took step 4. So some of those names are going to come off of the first column, and they're going to be used for a list for steps 8 and 9 when we get there. So in the first column, we'll put an 8 and we'll put a 9. You see what this has done for us? This simple little inventory now has set us up with everything we need resentment-wise for 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. Not only have resentments disappeared, but we're also beginning to look at now what we're going to have to change in the future. if we want to live free of those resentments. Okay, guys, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, both of you. Appreciate it. Now, I hear one of you sitting back there saying this. Well, Charlie, that's probably right for those that we did something to them. But how about those that did something to us that we didn't do anything to set it in motion? How about those that hurt us when we were kids growing up? How about those we were married to that hurt us and we didn't do anything to cause that? Aren't we justified in having that kind of resentment? I guess we are if we want to get drunk. But a justified resentment blocks us off from the sunlight of the Spirit, just like an unjustified resentment does. Whoever we resent, they are controlling our thinking, justified or unjustified. Now, if you've got one of those, and believe me, it doesn't make any difference what it is. You know, there's just certain degrees of badness. It doesn't make any difference what it is. If you've got one of those resentments and you don't want to get rid of it, knowing that it might get you drunk, let's put it on this sheet of paper. Let's put their name, what they did to us, the part of self that was affected. Then let's look in the fourth column and let's see if maybe some of our own character defects are causing us to hold on to that resentment. Maybe we're using it for justification and rationalization. The lady in the book used her resentment against her mother to justify her lack of education. Greatest excuse in the world. If Mama hadn't have done that to me, I would have been able to get an education. Poor little me. Or just as importantly, we can use that kind of resentment to rationalize and justify doing things we know we shouldn't be doing. And we can say to ourselves, if they hadn't have made me this way, I wouldn't have to be doing these things. That's nothing in the world but rationalization and justification. And if we've got one of those resentments like that, and we don't want to get rid of it, knowing it might get us drunk, let's look at it very, very closely, because we're probably using it for something. Are we so selfish that we absolutely refuse to face life without it? Are we so dishonest with ourselves we refuse to see the truth of it? Now, let me tell you, if you've got one of them, it's not true. It started with truth. But if you've played it over and over and over in your head, like every human being does, the picture has been distorted. It is no longer true. Let's honestly look at that thing and see what really did happen. And maybe when we see the truth of it, maybe it's not as bad as we thought it was. Are we so afraid of facing life without it that we absolutely refuse to turn it loose? Are we so inconsiderate of another human being that we fail to realize that those people who do those things to us, they're not bad people, they're sick people. They do it to us out of their sickness also. And they didn't necessarily do it to us, they would have done it to anybody in that position. If we could even begin to consider that fact, maybe we could start a forgiving process for another human being. Maybe we could straighten up a relationship with another human being before it's too late. It really doesn't make any sense now to let somebody hurt us 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago, and then let them hurt us every day for the rest of our lives. If we're resenting them, they're controlling our thinking. If they're controlling our thinking, they're dominating our lives for us. And they've got the power to kill us. Because eventually this will block us off from God, and eventually we get drunk over it. And I'm just not going to let people do that to me anymore because I don't have to. You see, I didn't know what to do about this stuff before I did this inventory. But today I know if I look at that really honestly, and if I'll consider the fact they're sick people, just maybe I can start getting rid of that resentment. And maybe I can be free of that for the rest of my life. At the very least, if we can't get rid of it any other way, we can sit down and pray for them. And pray that God give them in their lives what we want in ours, the same peace of mind, serenity, and happiness, and I'll guarantee you, I don't care what they did to you, after a while, that resentment will disappear, if we want it to. If we don't want it to, then we must be using it for something else. You know, I think we're making a great mistake in AA. We're sitting around our tables in our meeting rooms, and we're discussing all of these problems and all of these things those people have done to us, and we're trying to figure out why they did them to us. Hell, we'll never know why they did it to us. All we know is that they did it. And after we discuss that for a while, then we sit around and we try to figure out why it made us the way we are. We'll never understand that. The fact is, that's the way we are. Now, the thing is, do we want to get rid of it? If we want to get rid of it, we have the tools to do it. If we don't, then we'll never get rid of it. And you and I are responsible for the way we feel, for the way we think, and the things we do. Before I knew this, I wasn't responsible. Those suckers that hurt me were responsible. But today, I know different, and I'm responsible today. I can't blame it on Barbara anymore. Can't blame it on Mama. Can't blame it on Daddy. Can't blame it on anybody. If I stay resentful and angry, it must be because that's what I want to do. Joe?
Everything else fails, pray for them. They need the prayers, and we need to practice. That's all I have on resentments tonight.
Yeah, Joe told me a while ago the rest of the inventory is fear and sex. And Joe said, Charlie, I'm tired and I got a headache. Why don't we wait and do sex tomorrow morning? We'll get us a good night's sleep and then we'll have sex on Sunday morning. Is that okay?